The quiet slave woman no one wanted. Until she saw flames, while others slept. The November rain hammered against the windows of the agricultural processing facility in rural Virginia, a relentless percussion that matched the rhythm of machinery inside. Maria Cardoso had learned to disappear into the sound, to become invisible among the other workers who moved through the cold warehouse like ghosts. At 43, her hands were calloused from 15 years of work that never appeared on any official record, in a place that technically didn't exist on any map. She had arrived in America with hope folded carefully in her pocket like a fragile photograph. The recruiter in her village outside São Paulo had painted pictures of legitimate housekeeping work, legal documentation, and the promise of sending money home to her 2 daughters. Instead, Maria found herself trapped in a network that stretched across 3 states, moving between farms, factories, and warehouses, always one step ahead of any inspection, always invisible. The facility processed vegetables for major grocery chains, the kind of brands families trusted. During the day, Maria and 37 other workers sorted, cleaned, and packaged produce in refrigerated rooms that kept the temperature just above freezing. At night, they slept in a converted barn behind the main building, where Supervisor Derek Morrison kept the only key to the exterior door. He was a heavy-set man with cold blue eyes who spoke little but watched everything, his presence a constant threat that required no words. Maria had learned the rules quickly. Never ask about the women who disappeared. Never mention the locked room on the 2nd floor, where Morrison sometimes took the younger workers. Never wonder why some girls arrived and vanished within weeks, replaced by new faces with the same haunted eyes. The disappeared were simply erased from conversation, as if they had never existed at all. On this particular November night, Maria couldn't sleep. The wind screamed around the barn's corners, and her bunk shook with each gust. She lay in the darkness, counting the breathing of the other women, a habit she had developed over months. 37 breaths that rose and fell in the cold air. 37 souls trapped in this purgatory between their stolen past and an impossible future. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Faint at first, just a whisper of something burning that didn't belong in the night air. Maria sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. The smell grew stronger, and she saw it through the high window near the ceiling, orange light flickering against the glass of the main facility. Fire. Her first instinct was to scream, to wake everyone, to pound on the locked door until Morrison came. But something stopped her. In that moment of hesitation, she heard voices outside, Morrison's voice and others she didn't recognize, men talking in low, urgent tones. She crept to the window, standing on her bunk to peer through the gap where the cold air leaked in. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water. Morrison stood beside a black pickup truck, talking to 2 other men in what looked like security uniforms. Between them, barely visible in the darkness, were 3 of the younger workers, hands bound, being loaded into the vehicle. One was Luz, a 16-year-old girl from Honduras, who had arrived just 2 weeks ago. Maria watched as Morrison accepted a thick envelope from one of the men, his face illuminated briefly by the interior light of the truck. The fire wasn't an accident, it was a distraction. Maria's hands shook as she climbed down from the bunk. Her mind raced through impossible calculations. If she woke the others now, Morrison would hear the commotion. The locked door meant they were trapped anyway, but if she did nothing, those girls would disappear forever, added to the list of names that no one was allowed to speak. She thought of her own daughters, 14 and 12, who believed their mother worked in a restaurant in New York and sent home money each month. The money Morrison allowed her to wire was a tiny fraction of what she earned, but it was enough to keep the lie alive, to let her daughters attend school and dream of better futures. But how could she live with herself if she did nothing now? The smell of smoke grew stronger. Maria made her decision. She moved through the darkness between the bunks, gently shaking the shoulders of the women she trusted most. Teresa, who had been here for 8 years. Yolanda, who still had scars on her wrists from trying to escape 3 years ago. Carmen, whose sister had disappeared last spring. In whispers that barely disturbed the air, Maria told them what she had seen. The fire, the truck, the girls being taken. Morrison's payment. The other women's eyes widened with a mixture of terror and recognition. They had all suspected, all known in that way, that the powerless know things without being told. But confirmation was different. Confirmation demanded action. Teresa's voice was barely audible. If we wake everyone now, he'll know someone saw. He'll know it was one of us. We have to get out, Yolanda hissed. The door is locked, Carmen finished. We're always locked in. Maria looked toward the window again. The orange glow was brighter now, flames visible through the facility's windows. The fire department would come eventually. Someone would see the smoke against the night sky, but by then those girls would be gone. And Morrison would have his story ready about workers who had left voluntarily, who had never existed in the first place. The window, Maria said suddenly. In the bathroom, it's small, but... She didn't need to finish. The 4 women moved together through the darkness, past the sleeping forms of their fellow prisoners. The bathroom was a cramped space with a single toilet and sink, and a window that had been painted shut years ago. But paint could be broken. Using the handle of a mop, they worked at the window frame, trying to keep the noise minimal. Each scrape of wood seemed impossibly loud in the quiet barn. Maria's heart hammered so hard she thought it might be visible through her shirt. Finally, the window gave way, swinging open to reveal the cold night air and freedom just beyond reach. The opening was barely 2 feet square, too small for most people. But Maria had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible. She had been invisible for so long that invisibility had become her greatest skill. Go, Teresa urged. You're the smallest. Get help. Maria hesitated. To leave meant to expose herself, to step out of the shadows and into a world where she had no legal right to exist. Immigration and customs enforcement would find her before any real help could arrive. She would be deported, separated from any chance of seeing her daughters again, all for women who might be beyond help already. But then she thought of Luz's face. Young and still holding on to hope despite everything. She thought of her own daughters and what she would want someone to do if they were in that truck, being driven toward a fate too terrible to imagine. Maria pulled herself through the window, her shoulders scraping against the frame, her shirt catching and tearing on a nail. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she dropped the 6 feet to the ground, landing hard enough to jar her teeth. Behind her, Teresa's face appeared in the window. "The fire department," Teresa whispered urgently. "Find them before they leave. Tell them about the truck, the girls." Maria nodded and ran. The facility sat on a rural road with no streetlights, surrounded by fields that stretched toward darkness in every direction. Maria's breath came in white clouds as she ran toward the main road, her thin canvas shoes slipping on the wet gravel. Behind her, the fire grew, and she could hear the first distant wail of sirens cutting through the night. She had been invisible for so long. Now she would have to be seen. The fire trucks arrived in a convoy of flashing lights and screaming sirens, their arrival shattering the rural silence. Maria stood at the edge of the road, waving her arms, her voice hoarse from shouting. The lead truck slowed, and a firefighter jumped down, his face showing confusion and concern. "Please," Maria gasped in broken English. "Girls in truck, men take them. Please, you have to stop them." The firefighter, a young man with kind eyes, radioed immediately to someone. More vehicles were arriving now, police cars and an ambulance. Maria tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a mixture of Portuguese and English. pointing back toward the facility, toward where she had seen the black truck. Then she saw Morrison. He was walking toward the emergency vehicles, his face arranged in an expression of concern, playing the role of the worried supervisor. When his eyes found Maria, something cold and dangerous flickered across his features for just a moment before the mask of concern slid back into place. "Maria!" he called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Thank God you're safe. I was so worried when I couldn't find everyone in the barn." A police officer approached, notebook in hand. "Sir, this woman is saying something about girls being taken in a truck." Morrison's laugh was perfectly calibrated, friendly and dismissive. "Officer, I'm afraid Maria sometimes gets confused. The stress, you understand. Some of the workers left yesterday to go to a different job site. It's all documented." Maria felt the world tilting. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment when her word, the word of an undocumented worker, would be measured against the word of an American citizen with documentation and authority. "He's lying," Maria said, forcing her voice to be steady. "I saw him. He took money. 3 girls, hands tied, black truck, 2 men in security uniforms." The officer's eyes moved between them. "Sir, I'm going to need to see that documentation, and we'll need to verify the whereabouts of all workers who were on site tonight." Morrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, officer. Everything is in order, but I should mention that Maria is not legally authorized to work in the United States. I've been meaning to report it, but I felt sorry for her situation." There it was, the threat laid bare. If Maria pushed this, she would be arrested, deported, lose everything. Her daughters would be left alone with no support. Morrison was giving her a chance to back down, to return to invisibility, to let those girls vanish like all the others. Maria thought of the envelope Morrison had accepted, thick with cash. She thought of Luz's face. She thought of all the disappeared women whose names no one was allowed to speak. "I saw what I saw," Maria said, her voice stronger now. "And there are 37 other women locked in that barn who can tell you what happens here." The fire chief had been listening to the exchange. He turned to one of his crew. "Check that barn. Get those women out now, whether it's a fire risk or not." As firefighters moved toward the barn, Morrison's mask finally slipped. His face darkened, and he took a step toward Maria, his hand moving toward his belt. But the police officer was faster, positioning himself between them. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them." Everything happened quickly after that. The firefighters broke open the barn door, and 37 frightened women emerged into the flashing lights. More police arrived, and Maria found herself telling her story again and again, to different officers, to people who identified themselves as FBI, to a woman from an organization that helped trafficking victims. Through it all, she watched as Morrison was placed in handcuffs, his face blank now, all pretense abandoned. She watched as officers searched his office and emerged with boxes of documents. She watched as Teresa, Yolanda, and Carmen told their own stories, and others found their voices too. Years of silence breaking like a dam. As dawn broke over Virginia, Maria sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee that tasted like the most expensive thing she had ever consumed. An FBI agent named Sarah Chen sat beside her, speaking in careful, clear English that Maria could mostly understand. "The truck was stopped 20 minutes ago at a way station in North Carolina," Agent Chen said. "The girls are safe because of you." Maria's hands shook around the coffee cup. "What happens now? To me?" Agent Chen's face was serious but not unkind. "That's complicated. You're going to have to answer a lot of questions. There will be investigations, probably trials, but there are protections for victims and witnesses of trafficking. We'll help you navigate that." "My daughters," Maria whispered. "In Brazil, they think I work in a restaurant." "We'll help with that too," Agent Chen promised. This network you've helped us uncover goes far beyond this facility. The documents Morrison kept, the people he was connected to. You've helped us expose something that's been operating for years. Over the following days, Maria learned the scope of what she had unveiled. The facility was part of a network that supplied cheap labor to agricultural operations across multiple states, using debt bondage, threats, and violence to keep workers compliant. Morrison was a middle manager in an organization that had been operating for over a decade, with connections to labor contractors, corrupt officials, and even some of the corporations that benefited from the cheap labor. The 3 girls in the truck had been sold to a brothel operation in North Carolina, but they were far from the first. Investigators estimated that over 300 women had moved through the network in the past 10 years, many of them simply disappearing without trace. Maria testified before a grand jury, her voice steady as she described what she had witnessed. Other women came forward too, finding courage in numbers, telling stories of violence and exploitation that had been hidden in plain sight. In facilities that processed food for American families, in farms that supplied major grocery chains. The legal process was slow and exhausting. Maria lived in a shelter for trafficking survivors, learning to navigate a world where she was no longer invisible but also not entirely free. Her immigration status remained in limbo, caught between witness protection and deportation proceedings. But 6 months after that November night, Maria sat in a victim assistance office and spoke to her daughters on video chat for the first time in 3 years. She told them the truth, all of it, watching their faces change from confusion to horror to something like pride. "Maman," her oldest daughter said, tears streaming down her face, "you saved those girls." "I did what any mother would do," Maria replied. "What I would want someone to do for you." The trials took 2 years. Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison for human trafficking, conspiracy, and kidnapping. 7 other members of the network received similar sentences. The corporations that had benefited from the labor paid massive fines and faced ongoing civil lawsuits from the survivors. Maria was granted a special visa for victims of trafficking who cooperated with law enforcement. It wasn't citizenship, not yet, but it was legal status, the right to exist without hiding. She found work at a non-profit organization that helped other trafficking survivors, using her experience to guide others through the maze of systems that were supposed to help, but often felt like just another form of entrapment. 3 years after that November night, Maria stood in a courthouse in Virginia and became a United States citizen. Her daughters, now 18 and 16, had been able to join her legally, their own immigration status resolved through the special provisions for family members of trafficking witnesses. At the ceremony, as Maria placed her hand over her heart and recited the oath of citizenship, she thought about invisibility and freedom. For so long she had believed that invisibility was survival, that to be unseen was to be safe. But true freedom, she had learned, came from being visible, from standing in the light and saying, "I am here, I matter, I will be heard." That night, Maria and her daughters went to dinner at a small Brazilian restaurant in Richmond. Over plates of feijoada, her youngest daughter asked the question that had been building for months. "Mama, were you scared that night when you ran?" Maria considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she admitted, "I was terrified, but I was more scared of doing nothing, of becoming the kind of person who could see something terrible and turn away." Her oldest daughter reached across the table and took her hand. "The girls you saved, Luz and the others, they came to the shelter last week while you were at work. They wanted to thank you." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes. "Are they okay?" "They're surviving, getting better. Luz is in school now. She wants to be a lawyer." "Surviving, getting better. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. It was honest. It was the truth that no one talked about in stories about trafficking and exploitation, that survival was a process, not a moment, and that freedom was something you had to choose every single day. As they left the restaurant, walking into the warm Virginia evening, Maria saw her reflection in a store window. A small woman in practical clothes, her face lined with years of hardship, her daughters flanking her like protective bookends. She looked ordinary, forgettable, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without leaving a trace. But she knew better now. She knew that the quietest voices, the most invisible people, were often the ones carrying the most powerful truths. She knew that freedom wasn't just about legal documents and citizenship papers. It was about the choice to be seen, to speak, to refuse to let terrible things happen in the darkness while everyone else slept. The disappeared would not be forgotten. Their names would be spoken. Their stories would be told. Because Maria had learned that the opposite of invisibility wasn't just visibility. It was witness. It was the willingness to see and be seen, even when seeing came at a terrible price. She had been the quiet slave woman no one wanted until she saw flames while others slept, and in that moment of choice she had become something more dangerous than any trafficker or corrupt system could handle. She had become a witness who refused to be silenced. Years later, when Maria spoke at conferences about human trafficking, when she trained law enforcement on the signs of labor exploitation, when she helped other survivors find their voices and their freedom, people would ask her the same question. Weren't you afraid of what would happen to you? And Maria would answer, with the truth she had learned that November night, standing in the cold rain, watching flames consume the place that had held her captive. I was terrified, but I learned that there are things more frightening than losing your freedom. The most terrifying thing is having the power to help and choosing not to use it. That's the worst kind of prison, the one we build in our own hearts. The flames had illuminated more than just a building that night. They had shown Maria who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. Not a victim, not a slave, but a witness, a survivor, a woman who chose freedom not just for herself, but for all the others who had been told they didn't matter, that their voices didn't count, that their stories would never be heard. In the end, that was the most powerful truth of all, that freedom was never just individual. It was collective, shared, something that expanded when given away rather than hoarded. Every woman Maria helped free was another crack in the system that had tried to keep them all invisible. Every story told was another light in the darkness, and the darkness, Maria had learned, could not survive when people chose to carry their own light, to be their own flames in the night, refusing to let others sleep while injustice burned all around them.